This is the story of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history that took place in rural Pennsylvania. Before we start, please leave a comment below telling us where you are and what time you heard this story. We want to know where these documented accounts come from and when they happen. In Berks County, Pennsylvania, in the summer of 1934, the heat was so bad that it felt like it was stuck to the rolling hills like a wet blanket. The drought had been going on for 3 months, making the usually fertile land into cracked earth that looked like old leather that had been left in the sun for too long. For weeks, the temperature had been consistently above 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and the local wells were starting to run dry. The corn died in the fields, and the animals huddled together in the shade they could find. But for people who lived near the property, which was just called Blackwell Farm, the summer silence wasn't just because it didn't rain. It was a quiet kind of silence that makes people talk more quietly as they walk by, the kind that makes people hurry when the sun starts to go down, the kind that gets into your bones and stays there long after you've left the area. The Blackwell property was on 127 acres of what had once been great farmland. It was between two ridges that made a natural valley about 8 miles southeast of Reading. The area had a unique topography with limestone outcroppings that made natural caves and underground formations all over the place. Local geologists had noticed that the valley where Blackwell Farm was located had a lot of these underground holes, but not many of them had been fully explored. The soil was rich and dark, which should have made it easy to grow a lot of crops. But neighbors had noticed for a long time that the plants on the Blackwell property always looked a little different from those on nearby farms. In some places it was greener, and in others it was strangely empty, as if the earth itself held secrets that changed what could grow on top of it. The farmhouse itself, built in 1847 by German immigrants, was a large 2-story building with thick stone walls made from limestone found nearby. The builder's practical sense was reflected in the architecture, which had small, deep-set windows that kept the house cool in the summer and warm in the winter. The windows also made the house look like a fortress, which seemed to keep casual visitors away. The windows were put in place asymmetrically, which makes it look like the inside was designed more for function than looks. The front porch, which was held up by heavy wooden posts that had darkened with age, went all the way across the front of the house and was deep enough to provide a lot of shade even in the hottest part of the day. A weathered red barn stood behind the main house. Its paint was peeling in long strips that fluttered in the wind like dead skin. The barn was bigger than most barns in the area, and it had a stone foundation that rose several feet above ground level, making it look like there were storage areas that were partly underground. The roof had been fixed many times over the years, and the newer shingles made a patchwork pattern that showed how well it had been cared for over the years. There were a number of smaller buildings on the property, such as a smokehouse, a workshop, and what looked like a spring house built over a natural water source. These buildings had slowly become less and less useful, though some looked old, but there were signs that they had been used recently. The Folkman family had owned the property for 3 generations before they sold it to Lysander Cray in 1923. He was a single man in his 40s who had come from somewhere in the Midwest with enough money to buy the farm outright and didn't seem to want to explain where that money had come from. The First National Bank of Reading has records that show Craig paid for the property with gold coins and old-looking money from the time of the Civil War. Jonathan Wessels, the bank president at the time, later said that the deal was strange, not only because of the way it was paid for, but also because Craig insisted that all the paperwork be done as quickly as possible, as if he wanted to establish legal ownership right away. Craig was tall and thin, with gray hair that had started to turn gray too soon, and eyes that were the color of the winter sky. It was hard to tell how old he was because his face didn't have many wrinkles, even though his hair was gray. This made him look ageless to some people. People who lived nearby thought it was strange. He had a slight accent that made it sound like he was from the upper Midwest, maybe Minnesota or Wisconsin. However, he never gave any details about where he was from. When asked about his past farming experience or what he planned to do with the property, he would give short, factual answers that satisfied curiosity without giving away anything important about his past. Craig had run the farm for more than 10 years with such carefulness that it was almost obsessive. Fixation. He mostly grew corn and wheat, but he also had a large vegetable garden and a small herd of cows, pigs, and chickens. Even though he seemed to use traditional farming methods instead of the newer ones that were becoming popular in the area, his crops always did better than those of nearby farms. Local agricultural extension agents who came to the farm said that Craig's soil looked unusually fertile, but they couldn't say why it was so productive. Things that would explain how productive it is. Craig took care of his property in a way that made it seem like he was going to live there for a long time. All of the fences were in great shape. Each building was kept in great shape, even though they were old. His animals were healthy and well-fed, and his tools were clean and put away properly. Visitors to the farm always said how well everything was organized, from the tools hanging in the barn to the way things were arranged in the farmhouse. Barn to the way things were set up in the farmhouse itself. The few neighbors who had a chance to meet him said he was polite but distant. He was the kind of person who would help with a barn raising or road repair but never stayed to talk afterward. He went to the local Lutheran church from time to time, sitting alone in the back pew and leaving right after the service without talking to anyone else, which is what usually happens after worship. He always showed up to community events when he did. He was polite and helpful, but he never tried to make friends or connect with people outside of what was needed for basic neighborly relations. They said his house was clean and neat, with simple, useful furniture that made it look like he cared more about function than comfort. People who were invited inside said that the furniture was sparse but well kept, with no personal touches that might give away anything about Craig's interests or background. There were no family pictures or books other than. There were no decorative items that might suggest hobbies or personal interests, just useful books about farming. It looked more like a temporary place to live than a permanent home, even though Craig had lived there for more than 10 years. But it was this careful normality that made the events of the summer of 1934 so scary. On the morning of July 23rd, when the mailman, Herbert Goff, came to the farm to drop off the mail, he saw something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Goff had been delivering mail to rural routes in Berks County for more than 15 years. He was proud of the fact that he always provided reliable service, no matter what the weather or other problems were. He knew the schedules and habits of every family on his route, and he could almost tell when something was wrong at any given property. The Blackwell farm was usually one of the easiest stops on his route because Craig was usually working in his garden or taking care of his animals. Every Tuesday at 10 a.m., Goff would come by, and Craig would greet him with a polite nod. They would sometimes talk briefly about the weather or the state of the roads, but Craig never talked to Goff for long. Goff, on this Tuesday, noticed right away that something was different. There were no sounds of farm work going on, and there was no sign of Craig anywhere on the property. The front door of the farmhouse was wide open, and the hot breeze made it move a little. Breeze that did nothing to cool down the hot weather. This was strange because Craig was known for being very careful about security and had never been seen leaving his house during the day without locking it. Goff yelled several times and his voice carried clearly across the eerily quiet farmyard, but there was no sound coming from inside the house. When Goff yelled, his voice seemed to disappear into the house without echoing, as if the inside somehow absorbed sound instead of bouncing it back, showing it. Goff would later tell the police that he had been getting more and more nervous as he got closer to the open door. The sun was beating down hard on the farmyard, and it was already very hot in the morning. But there was a cold draft coming from inside the house, and at first he couldn't place the smell. It wasn't the smell of death. It was something more subtle and disturbing, like the smell of wet earth and old metal that comes from a root cellar, with a metallic taste like old coins or rusty tools. Goff could see his breath when he leaned toward the door because the temperature difference was so great. This seemed impossible because of the heat outside. At first glance, everything inside looked normal. The kitchen table was set for one person, with a plate, cup, and silverware all in the right places, as if someone had been getting ready for a meal. The plate was white ceramic with a simple blue pattern around the edge, bought at any store in the area. The cup was placed exactly 2 inches from the plate, with the handle pointing to the right. This could mean that the person was very careful or very focused on the details. There was a folded-up newspaper from 3 days ago next to the plate. It was open to an article about crop failures in nearby counties and how the ongoing drought might affect the economy. The wood stove was cold, but the morning was already warm enough that it didn't need to be heated. There was a pot of coffee on the stove that was still half full, but it had long since gone cold and bitter. When Goff later told investigators about this detail, he said that the coffee looked like it had been made by Craig with his usual care, strong and black. However, it was clear that it had been sitting there for a few hours, maybe since the night before. The kerosene lamp on the kitchen counter had been turned off, but it was still warm to the touch, which meant it had been used recently, even though it was daytime. No need for artificial light. Goff yelled again, this time louder. His voice had a strange muffled quality that didn't match the normal sound of a wooden farmhouse. The sound seemed to be sucked up by the walls, which made for an effect that was both subtle and very creepy. He stepped inside when there was no answer. The sound of his boots on the wooden floors was hollow and seemed louder than it should have been in the oppressive silence. The parlor was quiet, with the furniture in the right place. But Goff couldn't put into words why the room felt wrong. The chairs were set up around a small table, and the books were stacked neatly on the shelves. Everything looked like it was in perfect order, but the way the light came through the windows was different. The way the shadows fell on the floor made it look like the room had been empty for more than just a few hours. Goff found something in the bedroom that made him rush back to town to get the sheriff. The bed was made with military precision, with the coverlid pulled tight enough to bounce a coin and the pillows arranged evenly against the headboard. But there was one thing on the nightstand next to the bed that didn't belong there, and Goff knew it hadn't been there on any of his other visits to the house. It was an old, yellowed picture of a group of people in front of what looked like the same farmhouse, but it was taken a long time ago. Earlier, maybe in the 1880s based on the style of the clothes and the photo. The picture was in a fancy tarnished silver frame, which made it look like it had been displayed prominently rather than just put away. The men in the picture were wearing dark suits, even though it looked like it was warm outside when the picture was taken. The women were wearing long dresses that were typical of German-American farming families in the late 1800s. Hair styled in intricate ways that were popular at the time. Their faces had the serious looks that were typical of formal portraits from that time, when long exposure times made it impossible to move, and photography was still seen as a serious event. But there was something about the picture that bothered Goff that he couldn't put his finger on at first. The picture looked normal, but there was something off about it. He looked at it more closely and realized that one of the people in the group looked very familiar. Standing, there was a tall, thin man with gray hair who looked a lot like Lander Cray, but he was a little bit different from the rest of the group. The picture was clearly taken decades before Cray bought the house, but the similarity was so strong that it seemed impossible that it was just a coincidence. However, the timeline didn't make sense. Sheriff Matthias Brennan got to the farm 2 hours after Goff called. Brennan was not a man who got upset easily. He had been the sheriff of Berks County for almost 8 years and had seen his. A lot of strange things happened in the small towns that were spread out across the area. He was a veteran of the Spanish-American War and had a practical way of doing police work that stressed thorough investigations and doubt about sensational explanations. People knew him for being calm under pressure and for his methodical way of solving cases. But later, Brennan would admit that there was something about the Blackwell farm that made him uneasy. Something more than just the fact that Lander Craig was missing. Gone. He said that as soon as he stepped onto the property, he felt an oppressive quality to the air, as if it were somehow heavier than normal. His horse, Duchess, a dependable mare who had gone with him on hundreds of investigations, got nervous as they got closer to the farmhouse and needed constant reassurance to keep from running away. The official investigation that came after was very thorough, but it didn't find many clear answers. Brennan carefully looked through every building on the property, making a list of what was inside and looking for anything that might help explain Craig's disappearance. Craig's things were still in the house. His clothes were neatly hung in the closet in rows by type and season. There was still a lot of money in gold coins and paper currency locked in a strong box under the floorboards of his bedroom. The deed to the property and other important papers were also in there. As recently as the night before, someone had taken care of his animals. Before he went missing, the barn had fresh hay, and the troughs had water. The animals looked healthy, but they were acting strangely and wouldn't eat, even though there was food and water available. Brennan said that the cows, which are usually interested in visitors, stayed away from people and huddled nervously in the far corner of their pasture. The pigs, who usually want food, didn't eat the slop that was put out for them, and the chickens stayed in their coop, even though it was daytime. There were no signs of a fight, no signs of theft, and nothing to show that Craig had been the victim of a common crime. His valuable things were still there, his tools and equipment were put away correctly, and his house was in perfect order, except for the strange picture and the feeling that something had changed. But some things bothered the investigators, details that made it seem like more than just a simple disappearance. In the basement below the kitchen, they found proof that someone had been working recently. The ground and floor looked like they had been disturbed, with fresh tool marks showing that digging had happened recently. The work looked planned and organized, not like random digging, but like a careful look at the foundation and the earth around it. Whatever project was going on had been stopped all of a sudden, and tools were left lying around, as if the worker had left in a hurry. When asked about this recent activity, Goff said that he had seen lights in the farmhouse windows from time to time. Late at night, usually around midnight or later, on his way home from town. Craig's late-night activities didn't fit with his usual routine, as all of his neighbors said he was an early riser who went to bed with the sun. The lights weren't the warm, steady glow of kerosene lamps. They were brighter and more focused, like someone was using specialized lighting to do detailed work. It was even more strange to find a bunch of notebooks hidden under a loose floorboard in what looked like an extra bedroom. The hiding place had been carefully built so that the floorboard was cut and put back together so perfectly that it was almost impossible to find without looking closely. The notebooks were wrapped in oiled cloth to keep them dry, and they were kept with a few other things that didn't seem to have anything to do with farming. The notebooks had very detailed records of Craig's farming activities, written in a neat, clear hand that kept track of everything from the weather to the crops, yields with scientific accuracy. Each entry had a date and information about the weather, such as temperature, humidity, wind direction, and more. Crop performance was recorded with mathematical accuracy, including plant height measurements, yield per acre estimates, and detailed notes about soil conditions in different parts of the property. But as Brennan read through the notebooks in order, he saw that the entries showed a slow but clear change in both handwriting and content, and information. The earlier entries were organized and useful, and they only talked about farming issues. The last pages, on the other hand, had more random thoughts about sounds heard at night, worries about neighbors who might have been watching the property, and repeated mentions of something he called the collection that needed to be properly cared for. One entry from July 15th, just 8 days before he went missing, said, "The summer heat has made them restless again. I can feel them moving below. The earth is drying and contracting, which makes it move and settle. Soon, the preservation process will need to start over. The timing must be perfect, as it has been for 47 years. The collection must not be allowed to get worse." The handwriting on the entry looked more rushed and less organized than the earlier records, which were more organized. Another entry from July 20th, just 3 days before he went missing, was even more upsetting. "They are starting to do things again. The timing has to be just right. After 47 years, the cycle is complete. Tomorrow is the day I start getting ready for the last time. It is important to choose the new additions carefully so that the work can continue. I can't let the Volkmann legacy end with me." After this entry was a list of people who had recently been seen in the area, along with physical descriptions and notes about where they were going. Dr. Cornelius Wendell, a doctor who sometimes worked with the police on strange cases, looked at these writings and at first thought they might be signs of the beginning of some kind of mental decline. He said that being alone for a long time without regular social contact could sometimes make people think in a confused way. This seemed like a logical reason for Craig's increasingly strange behavior and his eventual disappearance, which may have been caused by a complete mental breakdown that made him wander into the woods. But Dr. Wendell's idea didn't take into account other things that were found during the investigation, findings that pointed to something much more complicated than just mental illness. Investigators found a bunch of personal things in the barn that clearly didn't belong to Cray. These things were kept in wooden boxes that had been carefully organized and had dates on them that went back many decades. The crates themselves were from different times and places, which suggests that they were collected over time rather than bought, for a certain reason. The things in these crates were very strange. There were personal items like pocket watches, glasses, and jewelry that looked like they came from different decades because of how they were made and how they looked. There were clothes that had been carefully folded and stored, including clothes from different times that looked completely out of place on a farm owned by a single man. Personal items that told individual stories were the most interesting. A leather-bound diary written by a woman, and a man's wedding ring with initials and a date from 1889. A silk scarf that belonged to a woman and still smelled like perfume. Some of these things were travel documents, like train tickets, hotel receipts, and letters from people who had been passing through the area on their way to other places. Each item suggested a person who had owned it, taken care of it, and thought it was important enough to carry with them when they traveled. But for some reason, these things had ended up in Lysander Cray's barn. Sheriff Brennan asked neighbors about these things and found out that several families in the area had reported relatives going missing while traveling through the area over the years. These disappearances have been going on for decades, some even before Craig bought the property. They all followed the same pattern: people who had been seen in Reading or nearby towns buying things or asking for directions to places. That would have meant they had to go past the Blackwell farm, but they never made it to where they were supposed to go. The things found in the barn looked a lot like what families who had lost loved ones on trips that should have taken them near the Blackwell farm had said. Mrs. Isadora Felton, whose sister Cordelia went missing while traveling from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh in 1928, was able to identify a cameo brooch that was found among the stored items. The brooch had been a family heirloom that was so unique that there was no way to mix it up with anything else. It had a carved profile of a young woman on a pink coral background, with a border of seed pearls and rose gold that was only available from a certain Philadelphia jeweler. Mrs. Felton's identification of the brooch made people wonder right away how it could have gotten into Craig's hands. It was strange for a young woman in 1928 to be traveling alone, but it wasn't unheard of. Woman in 1928, but not the first time. She had a lot of cash with her and was going to buy land near Pittsburgh to start a business. Authorities in both Philadelphia and Pittsburgh had been told about her disappearance, but they had never found any sign of her, even after searching along the route she had planned to take. Finding her brooch in Cray's barn made it clear that she had passed through the area near Blackwell farm, and that something happened to her there. But the brooch was in perfect shape and had been carefully stored instead of thrown away or sold, which suggests that the owner kept it for reasons other than its monetary value. This pattern matched other things found in the crates, all of which were in great shape even though they were old. As the investigation continued, Sheriff Brennan began to piece together a timeline that suggested Lysander Cray might have been involved in these disappearances long before his own. Vanishing. But the evidence was circumstantial, and without Cray himself to question, it was impossible to prove any wrongdoing. Moreover, the disappearances seemed to follow patterns that suggested systematic planning rather than random encounters, indicating a level of organization that was difficult to reconcile with the image of a solitary farmer. The case became even more troubling when investigators discovered that the disappearances seemed to follow a specific pattern. Nearly all had occurred during the summer months, particularly during periods of extreme heat when travel was most difficult and travelers were likely to seek shelter or assistance. Most of the people involved were traveling alone or in very small groups, which made it less likely that they would be missed right away, and less likely that someone would come looking for them if they didn't make it to their destination. Local records showed that these people had usually been seen in Reading or nearby towns in the late morning or early afternoon, buying things or asking for directions to places that would have required them to go past Blackwell Farm in the late afternoon or evening. This timing would have brought them to the farm during the hottest part of the day, when they were most likely to get heat exhaustion and most likely to accept help. Dr. Wendell, who kept giving advice on the case even though he wasn't sure at first, came up with a theory that said Cray was systematically going after weak travelers and using their bad situation to get them to come to his land. Dr. Wendell said that something had happened to these travelers that stopped them from going on their journeys once they got there. This would make sense of the personal items found in the barn and the way people have been going missing over time. But this theory didn't explain a number of strange things about the case. First, a lot of the people who went missing weren't carrying a lot of cash or valuable items, which made robbery an unlikely reason. Second, the way Cray carefully stored his personal things made it seem like he was keeping them for reasons other than their monetary value. Third, the fact that people were disappearing in a planned and an organized way made it clear that these weren't just random encounters. The most troubling thing was finding out that the disappearances seemed to happen every 18 to 24 months, and that each time, the people who go missing fit certain criteria based on their age and physical traits. This pattern didn't suggest random encounters. Instead, it suggested that people were being chosen based on set criteria, which meant that there was a reason for the theft that went beyond just stealing. One discovery that was especially troubling was made in late August 1934, almost a month after Craig went missing. Barnabas Mueller, a farm worker hired by the county to care for the abandoned animals until they could be sold at auction, said he found a hidden room under the farmhouse. People knew Mueller as a trustworthy young man, for being honest and down to earth, which made his story very believable. The room had a strange entrance that was hidden behind the cellar stairs. It was so well hidden that it was missed during the first investigation of the property. It looked like a solid stone wall covered the entrance, but Mueller had noticed that some parts sounded hollow when they were tapped. When he pushed on these spots, part of the wall swung inward, showing a narrow. A passage that led to a room carved out of the limestone bedrock that the house was built on. Mueller said that the secret room was well organized, with shelves lining the walls and what looked like a workshop inside. The room was bigger than we thought it would be. It was about 12 feet square and 8 feet high, and the walls were carefully lined with fitted stone blocks. The building was done by professionals and took a lot of time and work to finish. There were a lot of containers on the shelves, and each one carefully marked and kept safe. Some of them looked like they had plant specimens in them, like roots, leaves, and flowers, from plants that don't grow in Pennsylvania. Others had what looked like geological samples, such as minerals and rock formations that made it look like they had done a lot of research on the area. The most puzzling thing was containers that held what looked like organic materials that had been preserved in ways that were not clear. There were detailed drawings on the walls that showed amazing scientific knowledge. These included geological surveys of the area, botanical studies of the plants that grow there, and astronomical charts that showed how the stars moved with mathematical accuracy. The drawings were done by a professional and were so accurate that they looked like they had been trained in science or had learned a lot on their own. There were handwritten notes with the drawings that gave detailed descriptions of the specimens being studied. These notes had measurements and descriptions of strange traits and ideas about how different natural events are connected. The handwriting was neat and exact, like the writing in Craig's farming notebooks, but the information showed that the person knew a lot more than what a normal farmer would know. Sheriff Brennan found proof that this secret workshop had been used regularly for many years when he looked at it. The room was clean and well kept, with no signs of dust or neglect, even though Craig was missing. The equipment looked like it was of high quality, and it included instruments that would have been hard to find and expensive to buy in rural Pennsylvania. A row of wooden cabinets lined one wall, and each one had a date on it from 1902 to 1934. It looked like these cabinets held detailed records of a research project that was still going on. The documents contained scientifically accurate notes about the weather, soil, and geological formations in the area for decades. But these records showed that any research that had been going on at the Blackwell farm had started long before Cray bought the land. The first entries were from 1902, which was more than 20 years before Cray moved to Pennsylvania. This shows that the Volkman family, who owned the house before Cray, had done similar things. Sheriff Brennan looked into the circumstances of the 1923 sale of the farm to Cray after learning this, but the investigation only added to the mystery. Land. County records show that the Volkman family has owned the property since 1847, when it was first built by German immigrants named Heinrich and Greta Wollmann. For many years, the family did well, slowly growing their holdings and becoming respected members of the local farming community. Heinrich was known as an innovative farmer who tried out new crops and methods. His success had allowed him to buy more land and make his property a lot better. But by the start of the 1900s, the Volkman family had become more and more private. People in the area remembered that the last generation of Volkmans didn't come to town very often. They did their business through middlemen and seemed to discourage people from visiting their property. In 1885, Wilhelm Volkmann, Heinrich's son, took over running the farm, but he slowly stopped being involved in community activities and socializing. People in the area who remembered the Folkman family said that they changed slowly, but there was a clear change in how they acted in the 1890s. They used to be active members of the community, but now they were alone and suspicious of people who weren't from their area. They started to keep their farming practices secret by working at strange hours and turning away visitors without giving a reason. Reports of strange things happening on the property at night were the most worrying. For example, lights that moved in ways that didn't make sense with normal farming activities. A lawyer had taken care of the sale of the farm to Cray. The Volkman family never went to Philadelphia in person to do the deal. The legal papers said that Wilhelm Volkman had died in 1922 and left the property to his son Friedrich, who sold it right away. But when investigators tried to find Friedrich Volkman in 1934, they found that there was no record of him other than the documents that showed the property transfer. Along with the deed transfer was a letter in German that roughly translated to a set of instructions for keeping up with what was said to be the family's traditional research duties. This letter, which was found among CRE's papers, talked about the hidden workshop and gave detailed instructions for what was called the continuation of important studies. The letter also had warnings about how important it was to keep things secret and keep working without stopping. Friedrich Volkman signed the letter, but handwriting analysis showed that it was written by the same person who had made the scientific drawings in the secret workshop. This made people wonder what the connection was between the Volkman family and Lander Cray, and whether the sale of the property was part of a bigger plan to keep research going that had been going on for decades. It was even more interesting to find out that the letter had detailed maps of the area with specific geological features marked and explained. These maps showed where underground formations, water sources, and mineral deposits were. Matched perfectly with what was on the Blackwell property. The map showed that the person had spent a lot of time studying the area and knew it well. Sheriff Brennan's case got more complicated and confusing with each new piece of evidence that came to light as the summer of 1934 came to an end. The evidence pointed to the Blackwell farm as the site of an ongoing research project for more than 30 years, maybe even longer, but without any. It was impossible to figure out exactly what had been studied or why, because there were no surviving participants or clear records of the project's purpose. The physical evidence showed that things were going on that were much more than normal farming. The scientific drawings, preserved specimens, and detailed records indicated a methodical examination of natural phenomena, potentially as a component of clandestine research necessitating confidentiality and seclusion. But it was still unclear what kind of research this was and how it was related to the missing travelers. Hard to figure out. Dr. Wendell, who kept giving advice on the case even though he was becoming more and more worried about what it meant, came up with a theory that involved some kind of scientific research that had been done without permission. He said that the scientific drawings and preserved specimens were proof that whoever was responsible was trying to study natural phenomena in ways that established scientific institutions might not have approved of. This theory would account for the secretive nature of the actions and the need to be alone so that no one can see them. If the researchers were doing studies without permission, they would have to keep them secret so that authorities or other scientists wouldn't get in the way. To keep this secret, it might have been necessary for travelers to go missing. While the precise methods were ambiguous, this theory inadequately elucidated the reasons for the persistence of such research across generations, or the motivations of ordinary farmers to participate in intricate scientific endeavors. Things to do. Also, the fact that both the Folkman family and Lander Cray had completely disappeared suggested that something had finally broken whatever system they had set up. There was proof in the secret workshop that the research had been going on until the time Craig went missing. There had been new entries in the research journals. New specimens had been gathered and preserved, and the tools showed signs of being used often. This made it seem like Cray hadn't given up on the job, but he had been working on it until something made him disappear too. In September 1934, the official investigation stopped because there wasn't enough evidence and there weren't any suspects to question. A court order sealed the farm, and when no heirs could be found for either the Folkman family or Lander Cray, the property went back to the county. When the missing people's families could be sure of who they were, the personal items found in the barn were given back to them. But some things were still not claimed. The Blackwell farm was empty for a number of years, and as nature took over the well-kept property, it slowly fell into disrepair. The county tried to sell the farm several times, but people who were interested in buying it were put off by its bad reputation and the amount of work that would be needed to make it productive again. People in the area stayed away, and stories started to spread about strange things that happened near the empty buildings. At first, these stories were. People thought they were just stories, but they were reported so often that they started to get official attention. Several people said they saw lights moving through the farmhouse windows at night, even though the building was supposed to be empty and sealed off. Some people said they heard noises coming from the property, including what sounded like construction work being done after dark. When the police looked into these reports, they usually didn't find any proof of trespassing or unauthorized activity. The building's seals were still in place, and there was no evidence that anyone had been on the property. But the reports kept coming in at an alarming rate, which suggested that something strange was happening at the farm. A development company bought the farm in 1938 with the idea of splitting it up into smaller lots for homes. Keystone Development Corporation had a lot of experience turning rural properties into suburban homes, so they were sure they could do it. Could get through any problems that came up at the site. They hired a team of skilled builders and started tearing down the old buildings to make room for new ones. Workers started digging up the foundation of the old farmhouse during this demolition work, which led to another important discovery. They found a number of underground chambers that the first investigation had missed. These rooms were a lot bigger and more detailed than the Barnabas Mueller found a hidden workshop that suggests a level of construction that would have taken a lot of time, effort, and skill. It looked like the chambers had been carved right into the bedrock under the house, making a network of tunnels and rooms that went far beyond the building's footprint. The excavation was done very well, using the natural limestone formations to make chambers that were strong enough to hold up the weight of the building above, while still being completely hidden from view. The walls were made of fitted stone blocks and had carved symbols and writing on them that looked like a mix of scientific notations, astronomical calculations, and geometric patterns. The symbols hinted at some kind of organized record-keeping, but it wasn't clear what they meant. The writing on the stones looked like it was in more than one language, such as German, Latin, and symbols that looked like math or scientific writing. The chambers had signs of activities that went well beyond just storing things or using them as a workshop. There were rooms that looked like they were made for certain tasks and had special equipment and fixtures that made it look like they would be used for a long time. Carved into the rock were complicated ventilation systems that let air flow through the whole underground complex. Storage areas held materials and tools whose uses were unknown. The most important things were a lot of containers, and there are storage systems all over the complex, and they are all organized in a systematic way. The containers were carefully labeled and kept safe, which suggests that what was inside was thought to be valuable and worth keeping for a long time. The way these materials were put together showed that there was a lot more planning and purpose than just gathering them. The discovery of these chambers led to a new investigation, this time with the help of state officials and experts who had experience with archaeological sites that are out of the ordinary. The Pennsylvania State Police assigned the case to Detective Lieutenant Harrison Blackwood, a seasoned investigator who has worked on many difficult cases. Blackwood put together a group of experts, such as archaeologists and structural engineers, to do a full inspection of the site. The underground complex was carefully mapped and documented, showing that it had been built over many years into a complicated system. There were tunnels that connected the rooms, made a logical network, which shows that they planned it out carefully and knew how to build things. The building quality was very high, and there were signs of advanced methods that would have been hard to do without professional help. The carved symbols and inscriptions were examined, and it was found that they contained scientific and mathematical information that was very advanced for the time. The notes had astronomical calculations, geological surveys, and what looked like chemical formulas. That showed an understanding of scientific ideas that most people didn't know about in the early 1900s. The experts who looked at the site said that the underground complex was built for more than just storing things or working in a workshop. The advanced construction, scientific knowledge, and careful planning all pointed to the fact that this was the site of serious research that needed to be kept secret and done over a long period of time. But the investigation also showed something bad about the site's recent past. The underground complex had been empty for years, but it looked like it had been used recently. New tool marks on some surfaces showed that someone had been working in the chambers, but there were no signs of entry at ground level. The equipment that should have been covered in dust looked like it had just been cleaned. It was even more disturbing that the preservation systems in the chambers seemed to have kept working. Still worked, even though the surface buildings were left behind. The temperature and humidity stayed the same, and the preservation material looked like it had been recently restocked. This made it seem like someone had been taking care of the underground facilities even after Craig went missing. The investigation team also found proof that the chambers held things that had been brought in from places far away from the area. Geological samples had rocks and minerals from places hundreds of miles away, botanical specimens from climates markedly distinct from Pennsylvania, alongside preserved materials that could solely have been acquired through extensive travel or trade networks. An examination of these materials uncovered patterns indicative of systematic collection based on defined criteria. The specimens were not random samples. They seemed to have been chosen for specific traits or qualities. The organization and labeling system showed that this collection was for scientific purposes, but it wasn't clear what they were. It was still not clear what kind of research it was. Detective Lieutenant Blackwood's investigation went on for several months, but in the end it was just as hard as the first one into Lysander Craig's disappearance. The proof clearly showed that Blackwell Farm had been the site of advanced research for decades, but the goal of this research and what would happen to the people involved were still unknown. The physical evidence indicated that the research had been executed by people who know a lot about science and have a lot of money. The quality of the construction, the complexity of the equipment, and the size of the specimen collection all showed that the people who built it were much more capable than normal farmers or researchers working alone. What was most confusing was how systematic the work was, and how the activities went on for generations. The evidence demonstrated that the research had been conducted for a minimum of 40 years, involving numerous individuals who had somehow sustained consistency of method and purpose over decades. This could mean either a lot of dedication to a certain project or some kind of organization that went beyond the people who were involved. In 1939, the development company abandoned its plans for the property after workers refused to continue excavation work following the discovery of the underground chambers. Local newspapers said that some crew members had seen or heard things that made them feel bad while working in the underground complex. There were also rumors. People started to say that the site was dangerous or not welcoming to outsiders in some way. The property was sealed again, this time for good, and the state of Pennsylvania took ownership when the development company went out of business because it couldn't afford to finish the project. Concrete was poured into the underground chambers to keep people from getting in without permission, and the buildings on the surface were completely destroyed. By 1940, there was nothing left of the original farm but a few scattered foundation stones and locked doors that lead to the underground complex. But the story of Blackwell Farm didn't end when it was destroyed. As the years went by, people who lived nearby started to notice strange things happening at the old farm site. Most of the time, these reports said that the air in that valley was different from the air in other places, as if the air itself were somehow different. Animals seemed to stay away from the area, and even experienced outdoorsmen said they felt lost or anxious when going through the area. Reports from people who said they saw signs that someone was still visiting the site, despite the barriers and warning signs that had been put up around the perimeter, were more worrying. These reports talked about finding signs of recent activity, tools left behind by visitors who weren't known, and lights moving through the area at night. When authorities looked into these claims, they usually didn't find any hard proof of trespassing, but the reports kept coming in, and they were always bad. During World War II, the old farm site was briefly thought about as a possible place for military training exercises. However, this plan was dropped when advanced teams found structural problems in the sealed underground chambers that made the area unsuitable for large groups. Engineers from the government who looked at the site found that the concrete fill had settled unevenly, which could cause problems that would need a lot of work to fix safely. In 1945, Dr. Elena Vasquez, a research psychologist from Columbia University, got permission to study people who lived in the area when the farm was still in use. Dr. Vasquez wanted to know how people in isolated communities deal with strange things that happen and how stories and legends grow around them. Her research produced numerous comprehensive testimonies from individuals who were adults during the time Lander Cray possessed the property. These stories all said that there was an uneasy feeling in the community, even though not many people had talked about their worries at the time. The interview showed that people in the area knew something strange was going on at Blackwell Farm, but they weren't sure what to do about it. Several older residents said that the farm had a different feel than other properties in the area, but they couldn't quite put their finger on what it was. Didn't seem right. Some people remembered that traveling salespeople and workers who moved around a lot were not allowed to stay overnight in that part of the county, most of the time with vague references to bad roads or unfriendly people. The most important stories came from people who said their families had moved away because they lived too close to the Blackwell farm. One very detailed account came from Mrs. Constance Aldrich, who was a young woman living only 2 miles from the farm in the early 1930s. She told Dr. Vasquez that her family had thought about moving away because of a number of events that made them think the area wasn't friendly to regular people. Mrs. Aldrich said that she had found strange marks in her garden several times, always overnight, and always pointing toward Blackwell Farm. These were not normal footprints. They were strange depressions in the ground that looked like they had been made by tools or other unknown objects. It was even more troubling that the fact that these marks always stopped at the edge of her property, as if whatever was making them had been avoiding getting too close to her house on purpose. Her family's animals had started acting strangely. They wouldn't graze in parts of their property that faced the Blackwell farm and got upset whenever they had to go near that area. The animals moved around restlessly at night, as if something was bothering them that the humans couldn't see. Most. Mrs. Aldrich's story about seeing lights move through the farm buildings at times when she knew the property should have been empty was scary. These lights weren't the warm, steady glow of regular lights. Instead, they were brighter and more focused, and they moved in ways that made it look like they were being used for a purpose rather than just for fun. It looked like the lights were following set paths through the buildings, as if the person using them was doing organized work. Mrs. Aldrich also did what she had planned to do, said they heard noises that seemed to come from the farm at night. These weren't the usual sounds of country life. They were more mechanical and purposeful. She said she heard what sounded like construction or excavation work going on in the middle of the night. She heard tools hitting stone and dirt, machines she didn't know how to use, and sometimes what sounded like voices speaking in low, urgent tones. Dr. Vasquez's last interview. The person who did the interview was Barnabas Mueller, the same farmhand who found the secret workshop under the Cray farmhouse in 1934. Mueller, who now works as a foreman for a construction company in Reading, had never talked about his time on the farm in public other than his first report to Sheriff Brennan. But he agreed to give Dr. Vasquez a detailed account for his research, even though he had kept this information secret for more than 10 years. Mueller's story was much more than what he had told authorities 11 years earlier. 11 years ago, the authorities. He said that the hidden workshop had evidence that the research activities had been going on until the time Craig went missing. The preservation tools had just been used, and new materials were still being prepared. The scientific tools were clean and well kept, and they looked like they had been used regularly instead of being left behind. More important was Mueller's account of finding what looked like planning papers for the future. Research tasks. These included detailed maps of the area with specific geological features marked on them. This seemed to show where more specimens could be found. The maps had notes on the best times to collect things and how to get to faraway places without being noticed. There were also research journals that appeared to record ongoing studies that had been going on for decades. These journals had notes about the state of the environment in the area, geological formations, and botanical specimens that had been gathered and examined with scientific accuracy. Some entries had math problems and theoretical discussions that showed a level of understanding of scientific principles that seemed advanced for the time. Miller told Dr. Vasquez that he was sure that Craig's disappearance was not the end of the research work, but just a short break. He pointed to how well organized the workshop was and how much planning had gone into it as proof. As proof that the system was made to keep working even if the main researcher wasn't there. He thought that Cray hadn't been working alone, and that the other people who were working on the project had just moved their work to a different location after he went missing. Mueller's finding of letters hidden in the workshop that suggested ongoing communication with researchers in other places backed up this theory. The letters were written in a code that made it hard to tell exactly what they meant. The meaning was not clear, but they seemed to be about coordinating research activities at more than one location. References to the work and keeping the collection up to date made it seem like similar projects might have been done at other properties, maybe as part of a bigger research network. Dr. Vasquez's research abruptly ceased in December 1945 due to what was officially characterized as a personal crisis, necessitating her extended leave from Columbia University. She never put out a book. Her findings on the Blackwell farm case, and when her coworkers tried to get in touch with her about her research, she refused to talk about it or share her interview materials. In a short letter to the head of her department, she said that she had decided that some topics were too sensitive for academic study and that her research had brought up questions that were better left unanswered. She asked for her materials to be sealed and for no more research to be done on the subject. The university did what she asked and her. The Blackwell farm case files are still not available to the public. In 1948, the federal government bought the Blackwell farm property and turned it into a national forest preserve. This meant that it would never be developed or open to the public. Official records have purposely made it hard to find the exact location of the old farm. The area is now only marked as restricted wilderness, which means that people can't go there to protect the environment. But even today, more than 80. Researchers who look into strange historical events and unexplained phenomena are still interested in the case of Lysander Craig's disappearance years later. The physical evidence has been destroyed or locked away in secret archives for a long time, but the questions raised by the Blackwell farm investigation are still just as interesting today as they were in 1934. What drove people to do secret research for decades? How did these complicated operations stay hidden for so long with no one noticing? What happened to all the knowledge and materials that were gathered over these decades of research? This is probably the most confusing question of all. Did they just go away when their keepers did? Or did they find new uses for them in other places? Researchers today have found new patterns in the case that weren't clear to investigators in the 1930s, using computers to look at missing person reports from the area during the time in question. Period has found at least 37 people who went missing in ways that fit the Blackwell farm pattern. These cases cover a much larger area than was first thought, which suggests that the activities may have taken place in more than one county. It is even more interesting to learn that similar cases happened in other areas at the same time and involved properties that were similar to the Blackwell farm. Most of these cases were about single-family homes in the country, by people who keep to themselves, the systematic disappearance of travelers, and the finding of evidence that suggests secret research activities. Because these cases are so similar, people are wondering if they were just one-time events or part of a bigger pattern. Federal investigators who have looked into these patterns have found at least 8 other properties in the Midwest and Northeast where similar things may have happened in the early to mid-20th century. Most of these properties were left behind or destroyed in situations like those at Blackwell Farm, often after their owners mysteriously disappeared, and evidence was found that suggested strange things were going on. What made people do systematic research that needed so much secrecy and isolation? How did these kinds of operations get the tools and information they needed to do their complicated work? And maybe the most worrying thing of all is what happened to the results of their research. Did the knowledge that was kept by its owners just disappear, or did it find new uses in other situations? We may never be able to answer these questions for sure, but they remind us that human behavior is very complicated, and we may never fully understand it. The Blackwell farm case is one of the most mysterious cases of organized, secretive activity in American history. A mystery that shows how regular people can do amazing things when they have a reason to, that are still not visible to people outside. The methods and information that were supposedly created at Blackwell Farm seem to have been much more advanced than first thought. Recent examination of the documentation discovered at the site has uncovered indications of scientific comprehension that was extraordinarily sophisticated for its era. The research methods, preservation techniques, and systematic approaches all point to knowledge that would have taken years of study and practice to gain. It is even more confusing that there is proof that the things that happened at Blackwell were part of a planned program with clear goals and objectives that went beyond just doing research. The researchers were clearly working towards specific goals that needed ongoing study and development. This is shown by the careful documentation, the systematic way they collected specimens, and the gradual improvement of their methods. The valley, where the Blackwell farm used to be, is still empty and quiet today, with only concrete barriers and signs of danger that not many people see. Remote sensors keep an eye on the area to make sure no one can get in without permission, and the old farm buildings have been allowed to grow back into the forest. But on very quiet nights when the wind dies down and the forest is completely still, people who live nearby say they hear sounds that seem to come from deep inside the earth. People say that these sounds are rhythmic and mechanical, like some kind of machine is still working, somewhere deep down in the ground. Sometimes, people say they see lights that look like they are coming from the sealed entrances to the old underground chambers. It was only visible for a short time before it vanished again. Reports of voices that seem to carry on the wind and talk in urgent hush tones about work that must go on, no matter what time it is, are the most confusing. Maybe these are just things that people think of, the psychological effects of a story that is too complicated to forget easily. Or maybe they stand for something more, a reminder that some activities once started take on a life of their own and continue without the people who started them. No matter what, the Blackwell Farm's legacy shows how powerful people can be when they work together with people who have specific skills and long-term goals. The concrete barriers are still there, the warning signs are still up, and the official records are still sealed in restricted archives. Dr. Vasquez said that some knowledge might be too complicated for casual research. Some places should never be open to normal curiosity, and some stories, no matter how well documented, should serve as warnings about what can happen when people use their intelligence for things that most people don't understand. The Blackwell Farm case is a unique example of how regular people can do amazing things when they work together, for reasons that go beyond what is normally understood. But it also stands for something more worrying. The chance that these kinds of things happen more often than we think and are harder to find than we think. And that the skills and knowledge learned in places like Blackwell may have been useful in other times and places. The quiet that fills the Pennsylvania Valley today is not the peaceful quiet of nature taking back land that has been left behind. It is the deep silence of questions that don't have easy answers. Answers of knowledge that need to be kept even when everyone else thinks they should be forgotten. And maybe that's the most important thing that will last. The reminder that people can do a lot more than they think they can, and that some people will always want to push those limits, no matter what society says or thinks. Asians.